Well, welcome everyone. This is Knowledge is Power, Activism, and Political Literacy in Information Institutions. We are so grateful you're here. My name is Nicole Clarkson. I am the president of the ALA student chapter at Kent State University. I'm joined by my wonderful officers, members, and faculty liaison. And we also are joined by University of North Texas Library and Information Science Student Association, um, who partnered with us, as well as Kent State University's iSchool Graduate Student Advisory Council. I would like to officially present our two speakers, Kelly Jensen and John Kraska, and we are so happy to have you here. I'm going to give you the floor to introduce yourselves. I'm sure you can do it better than I ever could. So yeah.
Thanks, Nicole, for this invitation. It's really great to be here. Kelly, do you want to start with introducing yourself while I bring up the slides?
Sure. Yeah, welcome everybody. And I think it is awesome that library school students are showing up to have this conversation, because y'all are going to have a big influence in this as you come into the world of libraries, and being aware of what's going on and knowledgeable about what role you can play is going to be huge. My name is Kelly Jensen. I'm an editor at Book Riot. I've been there for 10 years now. Prior to that, I worked as a librarian, and when I heard that North Texas was going to be part of this, I got a little excited. I went to UT Austin for library school, so I've done some time in Texas as well. And yeah, John, do you want to introduce yourself? I guess I should say you and I have known each other for a number of years now. And I think this is the first official, I shouldn't say that. Maybe I will say it. This is the first official thing that Book Riot and every library have done together to bring some awareness to book bans and censorship.
Yeah, Kelly, it's great to be on with you again. We've had some good conversations specifically around these projects, and then with a number of different communities based on the findings here. So hi, folks, I'm John Kraska. I'm Executive Director for Every Library and the Every Library Institute. We do several different kinds of supports for library communities, either seizing opportunities or facing crises. We work on the last 11 years, we've worked on a number of different ballot initiatives for libraries around the country to help them secure new funding, either for operations or for building projects. In Ohio, we've done a bunch of them. The chance to be able to work in that kind of space around opportunity has also extended to our negotiations with city councils and county governments, with direct support for school librarians who are sometimes facing job cuts, sometimes rebuilding the workforce there. On our Every Library Institute side, that's our 501c3 nonprofit. We do public policy, tax policy, education policy. Across both organizations over the last 2 years and change now, it's been a lot of supports to confront politicized and performative book bans and book ban challenges. The work has been good work, and having a media partner like Book Riot on this project, having a partner like Kelly, who is on the ground, not only herself as a journalist and a former librarian, but a banned author herself, is an important place for me. We show up and we try and listen, and we try and help address crises around these book bans and these other situations. So, but she's part of the affected parties, as it were. All right, Kelly. So we've got our results for the Public Libraries and Book Bans Parents Perception Survey that we did at the end of September of 2023. This is the first in a series, folks, of parent perception surveys. We wanted to focus specifically on parents with this public library perceptions, and then we're in the field today, in fact, next couple of days, on perceptions of the profession of librarianship. That's going to be really an interesting one to unpack, I think, Kelly. And then we'll be out in the field towards the end of this month after American Thanksgiving to do perceptions of school libraries. The reason that we wanted to focus, folks, on parent perceptions as opposed to voters or residents in general is because so much of this rhetoric around performative and politicized book bans is around that parental control, parental concern, It's the overreach, if you will, of one parent or a small group of parents into every other parent's life when it comes to classifying books as being obscene or harmful to children. Let's find out what parents really think. So Kelly and I want to take you through some high-level findings, talk through the slides a little bit, and reserve some time at the end for questions, comments, concerns. Hopefully, this will be very interesting to you because I think it's fascinating stuff. So,
Yeah, I have spent the last few weeks going through some of the like crosstabs on this. So looking at answers in one section and what those people thought of other questions in here. And I mean, the amount of time you could spend diving into just this data and finding patterns and trends is like immeasurable.
yes.
Because it's fascinating.
Yep, and we are interested in working with library school students and faculty, unpacking the original data as well, and we can talk about that at the end too. So, Penn America, not part of the survey, but we want to name check Penn and talk about what they've been finding with their reports. The long and the short of it, folks, is that 87% of book bans that were recorded in school districts in 2022-2023 school year had a nearby chapter or affiliate of a national organization known for advancing censorship, which is a polite way of saying Moms for Liberty. It's a polite way to talk about the Purple Parents in Indiana. The parents, go ahead.
I was gonna say No Left Turn in Education.
Exactly.
Utah Parents United, Awake Illinois here in Illinois.
Yep, the Clean Up Alabama group that's emerging down there. The reason we start with this framework is to talk very clearly and plainly about how the book bans that are happening around the country that are from a legitimate source are not what we're talking about. When somebody has a sincerely held belief and says, "Hey, I've got a problem with this book. I'm a parent. I'm a taxpayer. I want to talk about this situation. I'd like to ask my library to consider removing it or moving it." That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a politicized environment that's utilizing book bans to advance a bigger agenda. We asked the first question of how aware are these parents back in September 2023 about book bans? It's interesting to see that there's a high level of awareness aggregate. I'm living where we do, Kelly. I mean, I look at 7% of people who are parents in this country who are not aware at all. They're okay. Well, I mean, you and I live in a different world.
Yeah, and I think about that particular answer, and I wonder. We haven't looked at the crosstabs on it to see like what kind of experiences parents these respondents have. So, and what I mean by that is somebody who just had a baby or has a very young one in the house might not be as aware as somebody who has older kids who are in the public school system and are maybe a little bit more tapped into what's happening. And likewise, I think it's important to think about where they may be getting their news and their messaging around book bans and education, because that, I think you and I, as you said, we're so steeped in it that like this is it's surprising to think about people not being aware, but there are, I think, good legitimate reasons why there may be some lack of awareness for it, but we come at it from a different place.
So we went on to ask two big questions. Has your child or children ever checked out a book that made you as a parent feel uncomfortable? And has your child or children ever checked out a book that made them feel uncomfortable? Fully 2/3, a supermajority of parents responded that it was no. My child has not been made uncomfortable by this book. I'm not uncomfortable by these books. This is a binary, though. This is yes or no. So fully 1/3 of parents in this survey report having some moment between a head scratch level of discomfort and a maybe we'll ban the book level of discomfort. It is not a small number to say that 2/3 of parents feel very secure in the titles that are either being recommended to them or they're picking up on the shelf at the public library. But 1/3 of parents saying that there's a level of discomfort or even peril, I think is a significant thing for us to talk about, because Well, I think a lot has to do with whether or not these are intermediated conversations that somebody's having as a librarian with a parent about the books, or if it's just them going in and picking books for themselves without having a librarian involved in these conversations.
So there's a question, I don't know how soon you're going to get to it, that we asked about how aware parents were of how librarians select materials that are
Yes.
getting. Is that the next one by
Oh,
chance?
I don't recall if it no, it's two or three more. Let's come back to that in just a second. Let me move through
Okay.
these real quick then.
Um,
So go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I want to come back to the percentage who have had children check out books that they're not comfortable with, the child not being comfortable with, or the parent not being comfortable with. I'll come back to it when we get to that next one.
Awesome. So we did ask about age-restricted library cards. The habits are different around the country, and this is a very evolving area. We wanted to gauge whether or not parents were paying attention. And this is a baseline, I would suggest, for future study as this project continues to move forward year over year. We asked, do you feel that your child or children are safe at the library? 92% of parents said yes, that they do feel that their children are safe. Um, the interesting part in here is that this number, as far as I can tell, and I'd like you to remember the 92% feeling safe in the library, the 66% who have not had discomfort put upon them by the library. These numbers, as we move through the survey results, there's a tension here because, as you'll see, when we get very specific into the nature of the book, the topics that are covered, the relationship of the individual to the issues, this 92% must be somewhat soft. I think, Kelly, this is the one that we want to do a throwback to. Do you know, we asked these parents around the country, and by the way, it was a statistically significant sample of parents stratified by all the key census demographic points, along with household income, educational attainment. There's a 4.5% margin of error. We asked those parents, do you know how librarians decide if a book should be in the library's collection? And it's a minority who do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this particular question is one that I've spent some time with this week, looking at the people who responded no to this question and what some of their other beliefs or experiences were with the library. Because it's interesting, I would think about myself. If I weren't a librarian, would I know how libraries get materials? Probably not, unless they've done some kind of presentation or I've asked. That said, like, I can't divorce my knowledge from what I would feel like at my current age in this current time, did I not have the experience, right? That all said, this particular question is interesting. I looked at the 53.5% who said no. And John, if you would go back to the slide about has your child ever borrowed this one? Yeah. So for the group that said no, they don't know how librarians select material, it was in the 80% in both of these, that these people have not had a book checked out by their child that made the child or made them uncomfortable, which I think is a really interesting point of tension, that in this subset of people who don't understand or don't know how books get on shelves, they have had less experience with materials that have made them uncomfortable or made their children uncomfortable, which I think is a really interesting data point.
Yeah, this is new information that you're sharing with me today, and with our community. That bears some reflection about what does it mean when we're doing everything from readers advisory to marketing, to social conversations and social coverage in the news about what we do. This idea that there's an opacity to how librarians make decisions, and yet the folks who are a little bit more like we sometimes talk about librarianship with that highly transformational vocabulary, and yet a lot of people, if they're not a power user of the library, you're kind of their book barista, you know. So yeah, that's a really curious crosstab there, Kelly.
It is, and I'm going to come back to it when we get to some of our more granular data, because there's some other tension that shows up with this particular question that
Mhm.
I think is fascinating, and I think also reflects on the kinds of conversations that are happening in the media and across social media, because I think we need to talk about those as two separate things, media and social media, and the impact that they're having on book bans and parental perceptions of book bans. So we're going to put a
Cool.
pin in that and come back to it.
Great. All right. So we asked these parents in the public library setting, how comfortable are you with the following themes in children's books? And the level of comfort um, around very comfortable and somewhat comfortable folks, you can see between LGBTQ characters and themes in children's books on the top left, and children's books about puberty and sexual education on the bottom right. The level of discomfort is much higher amongst parents when we use a label. And this is a labeling choice for us as a survey proctor. We labeled LGBTQ plus characters and themes, and then we labeled children's books about puberty and sexual education because there are times when a book banner is looking to criminalize or to create a framework around LGBTQ books that is obscene or harmful because it has characters or themes, and yet Americans are horrible about their shame around sex and sexuality. I think that we will not talk about anything like this in polite company. Let alone there are parents who, I mean, Kelly, the obverse of this is the survey that was run by um, Common Sense Media back in January of 2023, where they asked teenagers, where did you get your pornography? And 0% of them reported getting their pornography at the library. Everybody else was on their telephones or on their devices or their tablets. And they asked the same group of teenagers, how comfortable are you talking about sex and sexuality with your parents, with your religious leaders, with your counselors, your school, your doctor? And 20% of the kids said, I can't talk about it. Where do I get my information? Is from books. I mean, it's not that this comfort conversation this comfort and shame conversation is driving so much of the rhetoric around obscenity, inappropriate, and we have to confront it.
I agree. And I also, this is one of the pieces I wanted to come back to. So when I looked at the crosstabs, and again, this is just the subset of parents, the 54% or so who didn't know how librarians selected books. For
Mhm.
the most part, we asked about like 4 different categories of themes and their level of comfort with them. And within that subset, it was pretty similar to the survey as a whole, except when it came to LGBTQ characters and themes, they were more likely to be uncomfortable with those in
Hmm.
the books, which is a really interesting tension to think about, that they have had less concern or less experience with a book their child borrowed being uncomfortable either to them or to the child, but they are more uncomfortable with LGBTQ themes and characters than the overall survey, which we're going to get to another tab that explores this weird finding a little bit more, but it got me thinking a lot about the role that knowing how librarians select material might impact perceptions of books with LGBTQ characters and themes.
Mhm.
Obviously, we can't, causation here, but there's an interesting correlation because it appears that better understanding of how books are selected also shows up as more comfort with books in this particular category. The other
Mhm.
ones are pretty similar, but I think that there's something to be said too about so much of the rhetoric around book bans and LGBTQ books, I think, really is, even for people who don't understand what's going on in libraries or aren't as tapped in, like, it is still something is sinking in, something is sticking with them.
Well, it's interesting the carryover into the conversation about race. I mean, when we talk about race versus, when we use a term about race or racism as opposed to a term about social justice, the numbers are very different. And I'm not suggesting by sharing this information or testing these questions that we should dissemble about the history of race and racial tensions in this country. I mean, my goodness, it's the founding sin of America. And yet, when we are talking about books that have themes to them, the moment of triggering for a person who might have discomfort or shame around these issues, it's not just for them as patrons, though. It's for them as listeners to rhetoric coming from folks who are looking to weaponize and create very performative and politicized book bans. They will the rhetoric coming from folks who are doing these kinds of weaponized book banning attacks moves a book that is about social justice or that is about health and well-being into a category where they know it's going to make more majority members of their community uncomfortable. So partially it's telling the truth about what the book really is, and partially I'd suggest it's us being better also and talking about the truth of the fact that a book about race and racism is a true story. A book about an LGBTQ plus character or a theme there is I mean, these are our neighbors. There's a civil rights frame here, folks.
So there are three broad categories that have really been the target of book bans, and it started with critical race theory. So anything that kind of feels like it is critical race theory, particularly if it uses words like race and racism, those become easy targets. And this is all manufactured. You could literally trace this back to the person who decided that this is what the panic's going to be about.
Mhm.
And then there is the social emotional learning. That's one that has been a little bit tougher, I think, to slap books into that are being banned, but you do see it pop up. Like, you're able to see, the arguments that these books are social emotional learning books and thus shouldn't be in classrooms or in libraries. And then the third one is comprehensive sexuality education, and it's purposefully sexuality education as opposed to sexual education. And I think that we see that show up too in the previous slide where we're talking about puberty books versus LGBTQ characters and themes in books. And by purposely saying sexuality education, that's a very different story than sexual education.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, anybody who spends time reading through not just the book titles that are being challenged, but the reasoning behind them, you can see where these books slot in to each of these three, either individually or the ones that like really set the book banners off when they fall into multiple categories here.
That's right. So we asked a question about what age should children up to the age of 18 begin to have access to the following. Again, these are parents asking them about the public library setting. Kelly, we can read this in 6 different ways. And folks, you can read this at length on everylibraryinstitute.org. And there's links to it from Kelly's wonderful and Danica's wonderful coverage on Book Riot. You can get into the tabs, much more directly. But what I look at here is the tension between parents who believe that all ages and stages of a kid's life should have access to I'm not going to say controversial. I'm going to say difficult. No, I'm going to say non-majority stories. The tension between the parents who believe that any child, any age, and the parents who say never. This is where we see school board meetings and public library meetings going off the rails. This is where we see my opinion is bigger than your opinion and better than your opinion, and yet none of these age-related questions has any specific guidance under the Constitution. This is the place where America is grinding against itself, and it's playing out in your profession right now.
So this is another one of the categories that I wanted to pop back to, looking at that subset of
Yeah.
Parents who don't know how librarians select material. Again, numbers are pretty similar across the second, third, and fourth category here. So race and racism, social justice, and puberty and sex ed. They're very different, again, in books with LGBTQ characters, where in the overall survey, it was like 16% said never. It was 19% said never in the subset, which I think is a pretty interesting difference, particularly when you take it in context with how many of them also said that they were not comfortable. They had a higher percentage of people saying they were not comfortable with LGBTQ books. And in this particular category, we were really conscious of how we asked this question. And there's nothing in this question that says LGBTQ plus content. It specifically says characters. So there is, among the whole survey, 16% are never comfortable with anyone under 18 ever reading a book with a queer character in it, which is mind-boggling. And then when you look at that subset, it's 19%. A queer character, never.
That's fascinating. In general, does having access to books with the following themes have a positive impact on children, a negative impact on children, or a neutral impact on children? Parents, I mean, we will talk about social justice with nobility. We could talk about puberty and sex education almost to an even split in this country, like we're reasonable people. But we start talking about race, when we start talking about LGBTQ, the change from positive, the diminishment of this being a positive conversation, it means that we cannot stand on the virtue of having books. We have to not only have the books, we also have to educate about why do we have the books. We have the books possibly because they're interesting to the majority, but we have the books because of their relevance to different protected classes of minorities. And we can educate, we can interest, we can expose the majority. The only way we're going to get out of this problem, folks, is if we start telling a more bold truth, in my opinion.
And let me add to that and say this is where I think that the lack of knowledge of how librarians select material is impacting the perception of children's materials with LGBTQ characters. So in this, this is the overall survey, we see 32% say they have a negative impact. When I tell you that it's 40% for those who don't know, like that is chilling to think about. And to think about, this is, I think, where library workers need to consider how important it is to talk about selection, because I think that there's some kind of connection here. Maybe connection is not the right word. Maybe the better way to frame this is there's opportunity to better educate your community about why these books are important and why they belong on shelves. And I think that will help make what we see here, this overall 32%, still astronomically high, but that's lower than 40%. And that's the people who don't know.
That's a real statistically significant difference as well. Okay, so we asked a question about, to the best of your knowledge, have any books been banned at your own local public library this year? 40% of Americans say yes. Sorry, not Americans. 40% of parents in our survey said yes. I would suggest that this number is misunderstanding of the difference between actually having a book removed from the library and perhaps putting up a banned book display.
Mhm.
This survey was in the field back in September. It wasn't Banned Books Week, but just the fact that there's been so many conversations, 40% of libraries have not experienced a book ban. The next question, we asked their basic opinion as parents on whether or not book bans are a waste of time, if they infringe on their rights as a parent, and that if teens should have access to these materials. Over 2/3 of parents think that book banning as a concept is a waste of time. Almost 3/4 of parents believe that book bans infringe upon their own rights as a parent. You're making a choice for me as a library or as a school, and that 82% of parents across all these different demographic points believe that teenagers at least should have access to books that might be a little bit more difficult, a little bit more controversial. Um, and yet, I would like to suggest that we need to look at this data set, not just in the, oh, that's a good number kind of way, but like what's underneath the hood for the 33% of parents who are okay with book bans, the 25% who are okay with the idea that somebody else's decision about my civil liberty is okay. And again and again and again, that 18% or so who say, not even a teenager, not until they're out of my house. They can do whatever they want when they move out.
Um, to come back to that crosstab, like I said, I spent this week on this, so
It sounds
it's
like
been
it, yeah.
fascinating. This particular set of findings. So for the group that does not understand how librarians select material, they actually agree. Sorry, let me. Okay. They were less likely to agree that some. I'm trying to read a screen that I've written in language. Okay, so they are more likely to agree that teenagers should have access to books on controversial subjects and themes to the tune of 44%. However, they are also more likely to agree that some books in the children's section of the public library are not appropriate for any child.
Yeah.
Which is a
Yeah.
very interesting dynamic to look at again. Yes, it's important teens have access to these books, but not in my library because there are some books that are not appropriate for any child in my library.
Yes. And so the next couple of questions are getting to that point exactly. The librarians, we asked, should librarians be prosecuted for giving children access to certain books? Those of you who've worked in a public library, you may see the 25% of parents agreeing that librarians should be prosecuted as a high number. Some of you might feel it's a low number depending on where you worked. I mean, the idea that 25% of parents are okay asking the local district attorney or sheriff to come into the library and arrest the librarians, folks, we have got a real problem here. And I'm not being hyperbolic. We live in a society right now where obscenity laws in most states, they specifically provide for what's called a defense from prosecution for librarians, for museum professionals, for educators, for researchers, for scientific purposes. They provide a defense from prosecution for these professions against obscenity laws, because obscenity laws are criminal. And back when we were writing laws that made some sense, back in like the Kennedy era, under even in the Eisenhower administration, when they were writing these laws around criminal code, they said, we're not bringing in obscene books to begin with. Why should we have spurious prosecutions happen? And yet we've seen 2 states pass legislation this last session that would allow for prosecution. They would remove that defense from prosecution exemption. It was Arkansas, where the Arkansas Library Association, among other champions, went after that law in court, got it overturned. But there's still another state. It was Indiana, where through no fault of their own, the Indiana Library Federation campaigned like crazy against it. They got a bait and switch at the last minute, and the bait and switch happened legislatively at the 11th hour, they put a provision in to remove the defense and prosecution for educators. So that means art teachers, it means librarians, school librarians, it means English teachers. Beginning January 1st, there's a target on their back potentially. This is a major issue, I would suggest, in terms of how the profession's future needs to be supported in very specific ways. To de-escalate this agreement on the part of 25% of parents that we should prosecute. I mean, we see it in public health right now. We see it in elections. We see it in politics writ large. That's much bigger than some fringe. That's a quarter. Sorry, I'm soapboxing that one because I think it's the most perilous part of the legislative framework because there's no federal preemption for this. It's purely a state matter. Libraries should carry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You finish.
I was just going to go through the rest of the list.
What I was going to say is I looked at this particular crosstab specifically a couple weeks ago. Anybody can pull it up. And I thought it was interesting that of the 25, let's round up to, no, let's stay at 25% of individuals who thought librarians should be prosecuted for giving children access to certain books. A full 68% of those people had no idea how the books got on shelf.
Sure.
So that, is a pretty significant difference from the overall. And I think it also points to how important that knowledge is and having, I don't even want to say having access to that knowledge because that knowledge is pretty accessible. But rather, what can and should library workers be doing to ensure that, that 68% knows this, that 68% knows how the books get on shelf. Because I think that that's a key piece in, to speak to what you were saying, to ensure that the advocates are on the ground getting that information to the politicians and the lawmakers who are hearing from, the Moms for Liberty, the No Left Turn, those folks who are really pushing for this.
So the other elements on this, in terms of libraries should carry children's books that discuss complex topics like racism and sex. Libraries should have children's books with LGBTQ characters and stories. America's divided. And for us to have a conversation with our neighbors, with our patrons, with the elected and appointed leadership in our community about why. Why do we bring these in? The softness of this, on the somewhat agree, on carrying books about race and sex and LGBTQ characters and stories. We are in a position to talk about DEI in theoretical ways, and we're in a position to talk about why do we serve all people in our community without fear or favor. And what does tolerance mean in a civic rather than a religious or moral kind of way? The constitutional librarianship aspects of this conversation are very important. We talk a lot about the First Amendment, which is a freedom of speech conversation, but we need to talk more, I think, around the 14th Amendment and that equal protection. The idea that why do we bring the book in the library in the first place? If it's only to appease the majority's interest and to mollify their discomfort, that's a terrible reason to just bring books in. We have to be able to talk in that equal protection sort of way, that civil rights framework way, about why do we bring the book in the library in terms of its interest and relevance to those protected classes. All right, Kelly, I've got one eye on the clock here. I want to pick up the pace just a little bit. Who should be primarily responsible for making decisions about which books should be available for checkout? I want to know your crosstabs on this because it's nice to see librarians should be primarily responsible. But the second one is parent groups.
Those are the same responses I saw in both crosstabs, the ones where folks didn't know how librarians picked materials, and on the folks who thought librarians should be prosecuted for materials. Shakes out the same way. It's librarians at the top, followed by parent groups, library boards, and local elected officials.
Gotcha. Well, the idea that librarians and library boards, they have a natural and necessary role that's bigger than local electeds and state legislators, I think is very important to emphasize in our communications and in our media outreach. But where the softness is, well, why don't we get some parents involved? And why don't we get some parents involved rather than professional librarians or the library boards writing policy as elected or appointed officials? The unappointed parent group or the unelected parent group is the soft underbelly of a lot of state legislation.
And I
And
want to go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I want to really emphasize what is meant here by these parent groups are white people, straight
Yeah,
people who
yeah.
can show up to meetings at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night and
Mhm.
demand that they represent a whole community.
Yep, or at 3:15 on a Wednesday afternoon.
Right. These are the people who have the privilege to not be working at that time or, can leave work at that time or aren't having childcare duties at that time, any
Mhm.
host of reasons. The reason that there's such support behind parent groups is because it sounds great in theory, but in practice, we know that those pushing for it are those who want to maintain that power and want to retain that, majority voice and everything.
That's right. All right, so please consider write the following statements for how accurately they reflect your opinion. This has a couple of different aspects to it that I, the parent, am the one who's responsible for what my child reads. Less than 60% fully agree, but over almost, it's almost 90% say yes, it's me as the parent, which I'm relieved about.
Mhm.
Parents should be involved in helping their child to decide what to read. Again, the you add up the agrees and the somewhat agrees. That says parents are owning their responsibility. Now, those of you who have already worked in a public library job that know that that's not always the case. A lot of parents drop their kids off. A lot of kids come from after school time without a parent anywhere near them. Summer, you know, characters in books should be diverse and reflect multiple communities. So Kelly, this one always makes my head scratch because like only 10% do not agree or are unsure, and yet the rest of the survey is pointing towards not diverse and not multiple.
And you start to wonder what they mean by diverse and reflect multiple communities. We don't know, other than what they've already told us, and it's not that, it's something else.
Yeah. I mean, it does show to me that we have to be talking with the public as the library sector, not just with ourselves. We have to
Mhm.
be talking with the public about what we're doing and why we're doing it and for whose benefit and in whose interest. I mean, it doesn't add up to me that this answer, which is as statistically significant and sound as the rest of the survey, is so disjointed from the rest of it. Oh, and then we asked parents, do they use filters and apps or filters and blocks on their kids' stuff? This number is again, it's all but 13% agree or someone agree that they somehow or another do something to make sure that they're not letting their children be free range on the internet. This number is mythological based on surveys that have been done by other internet safety groups, by the way.
And this number also is pretty close to the I am the one responsible for what my children borrow
Hmm.
at the library.
Hmm.
So, how much
Hmm.
is aspirational or, as you say, mythological?
Hmm. All right, folks, we're going to a couple more questions. Sorry, a couple more survey points to share with you. If you want to queue up some comments, questions, concerns in the chat, or I'm not sure if you guys come on mic for this, but one way or another, if you can start queuing up your thoughts, we'd appreciate the chance to have some dialogue. Big question: is book banning an issue that is important to you when you vote? 64% of folks parents who respond to this say yes, and it cuts across party lines. It's interesting political alignment. 41% of Democrats, 30% of Republicans, almost 20% of independents. And folks who are in that no party area, you get up to 30% or so. If you aggregate not I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. Um, it's interesting because what we have in here is not virtuous or scoundrels. We've got everybody. If 64% of parents and they believe that you should go to jail they're in here. 64% of parents who believe that we should have a good dialogue about race and LGBTQ in this country. Both the people that I look at as somebody who runs a political action committee for libraries, they're on my side, they're in here, but I also know my opponents are as well. And that's a very important part of our civic conversation, because an uninformed library user potentially can influence public policy in very significant ways.
So an interesting crosstab on this one.
Yeah, I'm going to have one on this one.
So for the subset of those who did not know how librarians select material, it is an issue that is important to only 55% of them. So it's
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty big difference, and I think it speaks to. I'm not even going to talk about what I think it speaks to. I just thought it was a really interesting difference that maybe there's a little bit more apathy around this. Maybe there's a little bit less engagement around this topic with this particular group. If they're not aware of how books get selected, maybe that it's not important to them at the voting booth because they don't understand. But I think sitting with that and also sitting with their likelihood to say that books with LGBTQ characters should never be accessible to anyone under 18, also an interesting, like, where is that coming from? Like, where are these different opinions intersecting with this particular group?
So one thing that we've been doing at every library is talking to the major national political parties about book bans. We had a resolution that was proposed and passed by the Democratic National Committee back in early October, opposing book bans in libraries. There was a resolution that the Libertarian National Party took up but didn't pass. We're going to come back to them, opposing unconstitutional censorship. We've reached out to the Green Party. We've reached out to the RNC, the Republican National Committee, as well, about this in order to make sure that this becomes a nonpartisan conversation. The idea that we should have a platform plank in the presidential cycle coming up, or at least we should be giving the parties an opportunity to go on record, is an important one, I think, because the decisions that we make around law, the decisions we make around budgets, the decisions we make around policy for public libraries, academic libraries, and school libraries is fundamentally political. And those conversations are driven by the perceptions not of us as a special interest group, but of the perceptions of those registered voters and those stakeholders and those parents out there. So being engaged in this political process, in this political context, is certainly important. All right, Kelly, we're at 10 minutes to the top of our hour and the end of our brown bag here. I just want to make sure that we share this last element here. Every library is about to publish a white paper about the demographics of towns, counties, and school districts that have experienced book bans in the last year and a half or 2 years. The long story short, the too long don't read, is that, as Kelly mentioned a moment ago, higher rate of bachelor's degrees, whiter, higher income, higher percentage of homeowners, generally people who are employed, at least the communities have a higher workforce participation rate. Some communities are a little bit more Republican, but that isn't really driving it. The Democratic communities are impinged as well. This is the privilege, the privileged majority that's looking to maintain its privilege and majority. When you get right down to it, folks, these are discriminatory activities as much as they are conversations about the content of a particular book. Kelly, I love doing this presentation with you. I'm looking forward to our next one when we talk about the perception of librarians. Folks, everylibraryinstitute.org. You can find the Parents' Perception Survey. You can go to Book Riot and see Kelly's up-to-date analyses as well. I don't know, Kelly, what's on your mind? What's on their mind? How do we find out what's on people's minds here, team? Marianne, Mary, Nicole, what's the protocol today?
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for that presentation and for getting all of that extremely important information to us and to the world. We had some members of the student groups that were involved, that were going to ask questions. I don't know how many we're going to get to in 9 minutes, but I'm gonna pass the baton to our secretary who had agreed to ask the first question. Hopefully, we can go from there.
Great, and we'll be brief on our answers.
Thank you.
We'll try at least.
We'll try. Yeah. Oh, Joe, sorry, we can't hear you.
Right, I have to turn on my mic. That would help. Sorry. So my question had to do with the facts of the differences between the people who do know how libraries pick their books and those who don't. Do you guys have any idea like how much of that is they just haven't had the chance to learn it, or they they simply don't care, like are trying not to find out, like, you know, it doesn't matter how the books get in there, they just shouldn't be in there to begin with? Like, do you have any idea how that breaks down?
That's a really great question. And I think that that's the question that I was really wrestling with as I was looking at this particular crosstab, because we didn't ask. So we don't have input from the people who took the survey. All we could really do is look at some of the patterns and trends. And I will say that within this particular subset, the number of independent and no party affiliations was a little bit higher than the percentages at the whole, which I think says a couple things. And John, I know you've said something about this as well, but for me, part of it is, you know, this group is also less likely to say book bans are an issue for them at the ballot. So you know, if they are not affiliated with the two major parties in this country who are talking about this and using it to fuel, you know, their policies, you know, they just might not care, might not be listening to it, or they're purposefully doing that because, like, it is not, you know, a thing that their affiliation or non-affiliation is particularly attuned with right now.
I'm with you on that, Kelly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
All right. I'm hoping that we can hear from one of the student leaders from University of North Texas. Julie, would you like to take the next question? Okay, there might be some technical difficulties. I will. Okay, so Julie, if you're having technical difficulties, I'm going to go ahead and go next, and you're welcome to go after me if we still have time. So my question is, library advocates, whether they're within the library or outside of it, where are they needed most right now?
So here at every library, we run a platform called Fight for the First, which is a local organizing platform. It's like change.org, but it's not. But it's just for libraries. You keep the data, and we want to bring people in who are interested, concerned across a couple of different vectors: First Amendment, 14th Amendment, equal protection, civil liberties, all that kind of good stuff. When there's a crisis going on, whether you're inside or outside the library, to build out that team in that crisis environment. Outside of a community in crisis, whether it's a public library or school library, we would like to be able to help understand and organize humans who care, whether they work in libraries or haven't been to a library since they were kids themselves. So at everylibrary.org and our action platform, there's ways to sign up to be able to stand with. And we, alongside our partners in the media like Book Riot, talk about the issue a lot, provide pathways to support. There are states that are more perilous, even though your zip code might be okay. There are opportunities, though very scant these days in Congress, but there's a moral conversation here that we need to have with our neighbors. So helping people with the people who care to find other people who care, again, whether it's within a crisis environment on our fightforthefirst.org, or if it's folks who have a little bit more of a clear field, who want to see the world change for the positive or not slide any further, on everylibrary.org and our action platform.
And I'll add to that. I think one of the most simple, most basic things that folks can do is show up to a board meeting, talk at the board meeting. If you can't go in person, they're at annoying times for people who have responsibilities. Write a letter that goes in the board packet, that goes on the record. That's equally as important as showing up and talking. And, if you're in the position to do so, run for those boards. We have elections coming up in several states, including Ohio, I believe.
Tuesday.
Next week. And they are going to make a huge difference.
And ISDs in Texas too.
Mm-hmm. And Moms for Liberty is running candidates. They are proudly supporting candidates. And, if those candidates win, particularly in a lot of these very contentious districts, we're going to see more. We're going to see more books being banned and pulled, and yet the side that supports libraries and supports a diverse collection, aren't getting the same airtime. They're not showing up. And that's, I think, right now, a very basic, very crucial thing to do.
Nicole, just so you know, I put a couple of comments back in the chat if people want to go back in the threads and stuff, and a couple of thumbs ups on stuff too, like Marianne's comment here.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Hopefully we have should we try one more question? Do you think we have time for one more question? I would like to introduce my social media officer, Katie Gable, who I hope can ask one last question before we sign off.
Yeah, hello. First of all, thank you so much. This was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. So I have a question, being new to the MLIS program. This is only my first semester, kind of regarding if you think these politics of libraries and stuff, do you think they're well addressed in current curriculum, or is there something that at the instruction level for grad school that we need to be doing to kind of highlight this, that librarianship isn't a political job, it isn't a political position?
I love this. What's that?
You have strong opinions, Kelly. Go.
I do, because I've been thinking about this week. I just read a story, and I want to say it was out of Ohio it was either Northeast Ohio or Northwest Pennsylvania, in that area, like that Erie area. And this public library director was at a Democratic meeting talking about how important book bans were, and said that it wasn't addressed in her graduate program. And I thought to myself, your program failed you if it wasn't addressed at all in your program. And so I threw out a quick survey on Twitter, take that for what it is. And it had like 430 responses. A good 80% said it was addressed in some capacity in their program, which, good. But it also makes you wonder, how was it addressed in that program? Was it a one-off, like book bans happen? Was it a project? How up to date is the information on book bans and censorship? How much is embedded in talking about, like, make sure you know that the library you work at has a policy? These are important things, but I think that there is a lot more that can be done and should be done. And I think, when I speak personally, I did an internship in undergrad for in libraries, thinking that that's what I wanted to do. And my advisor had me do a project that was specifically related to book bans. And here I am 20 some years later, like, that was so influential and so important, and taught me, not just like finding out what books have been banned, but finding out the context around it and understanding where libraries can and should push back against that, and remind people, like, what the purpose of a library is and why it is so crucial to our democracy.
I would say that there's 3 literacies that need to be taught with more alacrity at ILS programs and iSchools, MLS programs and iSchools: political literacy, legal literacy, and financial literacy. If you don't know where money comes from, you don't know how to manage it, whether you're a department director or somebody with a limited budget, or somebody managing a multi-million-dollar governmental agency with hundreds of employees, the political literacy issues are extremely important. The the legal side of this, none of this should be going on right now. I'm going to say this really plainly. None of this should be going on right now. If we had a firm understanding of the Constitution, and we were able to brief our boards and our electeds in cities and counties, mostly counties, if we were willing to fight early in the courts, I mean, none of this should be going on. I'm concerned a little bit that it's either a low level of literacy on the part of library leaders, or we've left a door open somehow. And I'd like to dialogue with iSchools and MLS programs more about that. If we haven't updated our deck in 50 years, it's about time we start doing that. So thank you, Katie. I appreciate that.
To build on that too, there has been a lot of really good work done in the last 10, 15 years that pushes back against this idea of libraries as neutral spaces, that they're not neutral. I really think that needs to be pushed further, and I think it needs to be addressed why this was even an issue that came up in the first place. Libraries are nonpartisan, which is different than neutral, which is different than this idea that libraries shouldn't wade into these topics. They should, but it needs to be done consistently, and I think that there needs to be good education around the differences between those things.
Well, you and I have talked about this before. The Constitution has a point of view, and library policies are the most local expression of the Constitution. Nicole, thank you.
Absolutely, yes. I thank you for these wonderful answers to our questions. I thank all the participants who joined us today. I hope you learned a lot and are inspired. And this webinar will be posted to YouTube at a certain point. So if you thought this was powerful enough to share with other librarians, with other people you know, please do it. But that is it for today. And thank you again, Kelly and John, for leading this wonderful, wonderful event. We couldn't have done it without you, and this was phenomenal.
Well, happy to be in touch anytime, team.
Yeah, thank you for having us and having this conversation. I know John will agree with me. Like, it starts with y'all, because you guys are entering into this field, and if you're going with any ability to think about this, talk about this, learn more about it, that is going to be so helpful and so important in, turning things around.
Take care, team. Nice to be with you. Bye-bye.
Bye.